You got something in here you don't want me to see?
You're searching without consent. State your legal reason on camera.
All right. You're being detained.
Detained for what? You haven't stated a reason.
Shut up and turn around. Hands behind your back.
A traffic officer thought he could pull over a black man in a silver Mercedes, treat him like a criminal, search his car without consent, and then force an arrest when nothing turned up. What that officer didn't know was that the driver he was pushing around was an active senior deputy U.S. Marshal, and the entire stop was being recorded on Bodycam in a way that would be impossible to explain later. At this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now tell us where you're watching from, your state or country, in the comments. And if you like stories where people stay calm, keep their rights clear, and bad behavior gets real consequences, hit like and subscribe. Here's how it started. Malcolm Reed was driving home in a silver Mercedes. He was going the speed limit, staying in his lane, and using signals. It was early evening with steady traffic. The road ran past a shopping plaza and restaurants. A patrol car got behind him and stayed there for longer than normal. Malcolm noticed it but kept driving normally. He didn't speed up, slow down, or change lanes suddenly. Then the patrol car activated its lights. Malcolm signaled and pulled over to a safe spot on the shoulder. He shut off the engine, rolled the driver's window down, and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. Officer Tyler Grady walked up to the driver's side. He did not clearly state why Malcolm was being stopped. He immediately focused on the vehicle and Malcolm's identity. He asked for license and registration in a hostile tone. Malcolm provided his license and registration. He asked for the reason for the stop. Grady did not give a clear reason. He kept asking questions about the Mercedes, including who it belonged to and how Malcolm got it. His questions implied he believed the car was stolen or that Malcolm was involved in something illegal. Malcolm stayed calm and kept his responses limited to what was required. He asked again for the reason for the stop. Grady escalated. He ordered Malcolm to step out of the vehicle. Malcolm complied. He exited slowly and kept his hands visible. He stood where Grady directed him. Grady immediately performed a pat-down. It was rough and aggressive. Malcolm did not resist. He stayed still and kept his voice controlled. Malcolm stated clearly that he did not consent to any search of the vehicle. Grady ignored that statement. He positioned Malcolm away from the Mercedes and moved towards the vehicle as if he was going to search anyway. Malcolm repeated that he did not consent. Grady proceeded as if the refusal didn't matter and prepared to search the car. Grady searched the Mercedes anyway, even after Malcolm clearly stated he did not consent. He started in the front cabin, moving fast, like he wanted it to look routine. He opened the center console and looked through it. He checked the glove compartment. He moved items around and looked into smaller compartments, not because he had a specific safety concern, but because he was trying to find something, anything, that would justify the way he had been speaking to Malcolm since the first seconds of the stop. Malcolm stayed where Grady placed him, several steps away from the vehicle, positioned so he couldn't interfere. Malcolm kept his hands visible and kept his posture calm. He did not move toward the car. He didn't raise his voice. He repeated one key point clearly so the camera would catch it. He did not consent to a search. Grady ignored that and kept going. He leaned into the passenger side area and checked places that didn't match any claimed reason for the stop. He looked under the front seats. He checked door pockets. He didn't find anything. And instead of stopping, he expanded the search. He opened the rear doors and searched the back seat area. He lifted floor mats and checked underneath. He looked between seat cushions. It wasn't a quick look for a weapon within reach. It was a search meant to produce a result. While he did it, Grady kept talking, trying to build a story out loud. He described Malcolm as nervous and not answering simple questions, even though Malcolm's behavior was controlled and his answers were basic. Grady kept implying there were signs without naming what they were. That's a common move when there's no real basis. Keep saying there's something, but never commit to a specific fact that can be disproven. Malcolm did not argue back and forth. He didn't get pulled into a debate. He stayed focused on clear, short statements. His lack of consent, his cooperation with commands, and his request for the reason for the stop. Grady still found nothing. No contraband, no weapon, no stolen property indicators, no baggies, no smell source, no open containers, no tools or items that could be claimed as burglary tools. Nothing. At that point, Grady had two options: end the stop and walk away, or double down and try to regain control. He doubled down. He shut the door and turned back toward Malcolm, changing his tone from searching to accusing. He told Malcolm he was being detained. Malcolm asked for the reason. Grady did not provide a clear reason. He circled back to the same vague insinuations he'd used from the beginning, suspicion based on nothing concrete. Malcolm remained calm and asked again for the reason for the stop. He also stated again that he did not consent to the search that had just happened. Grady reacted like Malcolm's calmness was disrespect. That's when Grady escalated to physical control. He stepped into Malcolm's space, grabbed his arm, and moved to apply handcuffs. Malcolm did not pull away. He did not jerk. He did not tense up and give Grady a reason to claim resistance. He kept his hands positioned where Grady directed and allowed the cuffs to go on. But Malcolm made sure the record stayed clear. He said Grady was making a mistake and that his identity would be confirmed once his information was properly run. Grady acted like that didn't matter. He tightened the cuffs and continued treating it like a justified arrest. He walked Malcolm toward the patrol car, positioning him near the rear passenger side like he was about to place him inside. People were driving by. Some slowed down. A couple of heads turned from the sidewalk near the plaza entrance. Not a crowd, but enough visibility to make it humiliating and to make Grady feel like he had an audience. Then Grady finally did what he should have done at the start. He went to verify Malcolm's identity through dispatch. He radioed in Malcolm's name and information. His voice sounded confident, like he expected the system to back him up. Dispatch responded normally at first, then asked him to repeat the name and date of birth. Grady repeated it. There was a pause. Dispatch came back with a different tone, more formal, more careful. They informed him that Malcolm Reed returned as active law enforcement at the federal level, and that the record required additional confirmation. They instructed Grady to stand by. Grady tried to keep control of the scene, but the shift had already happened. He glanced at Malcolm, then away, as if he was recalculating. He started speaking faster on the radio, asking follow-up questions that sounded less like policing and more like damage control. Dispatch escalated it to a supervisor. Grady attempted to change his approach mid-stop. His posture softened slightly. His voice lowered. He stopped acting like Malcolm was a criminal suspect and started acting like this might become a problem for him personally. Malcolm didn't respond to the switch. He didn't argue. He didn't accept any "let's calm down" tone as if they were both equally responsible for what just happened. He stayed calm because he understood what mattered now: the footage, the sequence, and the lack of legal basis. Within minutes, Sergeant Dana Klein arrived. She didn't walk up like she was coming to support Grady emotionally. She walked up like she was there to take control of a situation that had already gone off track. She looked at Malcolm's cuffs first. Then she looked at Grady. Then she looked at the Mercedes. She asked Grady for the reason for the stop. Not the long version, not the opinion version, the actual reason. Grady tried to explain. It came out unclear and inconsistent. He referenced vague suspicion and tried to justify the search after the fact. Klein didn't argue with him on the shoulder. She did what competent supervisors do when they know something is wrong. She separated the officer from the driver and de-escalated immediately. She spoke directly to Malcolm in a professional tone and confirmed his identity through procedure. She had Malcolm uncuffed. She returned his license and registration. She kept the body cams running and made sure the stop ended without further escalation. Grady stood back, visibly frustrated, but he didn't have leverage anymore. The reason he didn't have leverage wasn't Malcolm's job title. It was the fact that Grady had created a stop with no solid justification, performed a search after non-consent, and then tried to turn the situation into an arrest when the search came up empty. Before Malcolm left, he made one clean statement to Klein that mattered. He didn't threaten. He didn't raise his voice. He made it clear that the footage would speak for itself and that the stop would be addressed through proper channels. Malcolm left the scene without raising his voice and without making it personal. He drove off, parked in a well-lit lot a few minutes away, and documented what mattered while it was fresh: the location, the approximate time, the sequence of events, and the key actions. No reason stated for the stop, rough pat-down, search after non-consent, cuffs with no evidence, and the name run that changed everything. He did not post online. He did not call friends to vent. He handled it like someone trained to build clean records. That night, Malcolm notified the right people through official channels. He reported that a local officer conducted an unlawful stop and search and attempted a baseless arrest while he was off duty. He included the officer's name and badge number, the patrol unit number if remembered, and the supervisor's name who responded. By the next morning, the department was already reacting. Because the moment a supervisor shows up to a stop involving an active federal law enforcement officer, the paperwork stops being optional. The stop gets logged, the body cam becomes evidence, and people above the patrol level start asking questions they can't ignore. Sergeant Dana Klein filed her own incident report. She included the basics. She responded to a traffic stop, verified the driver's identity, and terminated the detention. But she also had to account for why the stop escalated to cuffs and a search. That meant she had to document what Grady claimed and what he could actually support. And that's where Grady's story started collapsing. Grady wrote his version like most officers do when they know a review is coming. He tried to justify the stop with vague language. He described Malcolm as suspicious and implied there were indicators. He wrote that he felt officer safety concerns and suggested the search was necessary, but the body cam footage didn't match the report. A report can claim nervous behavior. The camera shows calm, compliant behavior. A report can claim refused to cooperate. The camera shows a driver providing license and registration and following commands. A report can claim probable cause. The camera shows no clear reason stated before the search, and a clear non-consent statement ignored. That gap is what turns a complaint into a case. Within days, Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation. They requested all recordings: Grady's body cam, Klein's body cam, any dash camera, and dispatch audio. They also pulled the CAD log to see the timeline, when the stop began, when the name was run, and exactly when the supervisor was called. They interviewed Grady first. That's standard. Give the officer a chance to explain before confronting him with the footage. Grady tried to keep his explanation broad. He said he believed the vehicle might be stolen. He said Malcolm's questions felt combative. He said he searched for safety reasons. He said the cuffs were to secure the scene. But IA doesn't build cases on feelings. They build them on policy and sequence. They asked him the simplest question: what traffic violation did he observe that justified the stop? Grady didn't have a clean answer. Then they asked the next one: what specific legal basis allowed him to search after the driver clearly stated he didn't consent? Grady tried to talk around it. Then they asked the one that ended his room to maneuver: why did he try to arrest when the search found nothing? Grady had no good answer for that because the video showed it was about control, not evidence. At the same time, Malcolm filed a civil rights complaint through the process that actually moves things: written statement, request for preservation of evidence, and a formal demand that the department retain all body cam and dispatch audio. He wasn't asking them to look into it. He was putting them on notice. He also retained counsel. The attorney didn't come in yelling. She came in methodical. She requested footage. She requested the officers stop history. She requested training records. She asked for prior complaints. She asked whether Grady had a pattern of stops that started as no reason stated and ended in searches. That's when the city's legal department got involved. Because this wasn't only a personnel problem, it was a liability problem. An unlawful stop, unlawful search, and false arrest exposure are exactly the kind of claims that cost departments real money, especially when video makes the timeline obvious. A few weeks later, the body cam footage was reviewed at a higher level. Not just IA, command staff, city attorneys, risk management, and the department could see it clearly. Grady's approach was wrong from the beginning. He escalated without facts. He ignored a clear statement of non-consent. He searched anyway. He found nothing. Then he tried to arrest anyway. That last part mattered the most. Searching with no basis is serious. Trying to arrest after the search fails is worse, because it shows the goal wasn't safety or investigation. It was authority. Grady was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His gun and badge were turned in. His patrol access was cut. His shifts were covered. It was quiet, but everyone in the building knew why. Then, the department tried the predictable internal move. Contain it. They reached out through official channels and floated the idea of resolving the situation quickly. Not an apology on the record. Not an admission of wrongdoing. More like an attempt to make it go away before it became public and before a lawsuit forced disclosures. Malcolm didn't take that route. He didn't want a quiet conversation. He wanted the record corrected and the behavior addressed. He understood what happens when incidents like this get handled quietly. The officer learns nothing. The department changes nothing. And the next driver doesn't have the same protection or documentation. So the case moved forward. A formal notice of claim was filed. The allegations were clear. Unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, false arrest attempt, and excessive force during the pat-down and handcuffing. It wasn't written with dramatic language. It was written with timestamps. And that's what made it dangerous for the city, because the facts weren't complicated. The video made them simple. The city couldn't treat this like a normal complaint anymore. Malcolm's attorney had the body cam footage, the dispatch audio, and the supervisor response in writing. The timeline was clear. No stated reason for the stop. Immediate criminal assumptions, a rough pat-down, a search after Malcolm said he didn't consent, then cuffs and an arrest attempt after the search produced nothing. That combination forced the city into decision mode. They opened formal settlement discussions, while internal affairs finished their work. That's common in cases like this, because the city doesn't want a jury watching body cam footage that makes the officer look reckless and the department look careless. Even if the city thinks it can defend parts of it, the risk is too high when the footage is straightforward. Internal Affairs completed its investigation and sustained multiple violations against Grady. The department didn't frame it as one mistake. They framed it as a pattern of bad judgment during a single encounter, initiating a stop without a clear, documented reason, escalating without evidence, conducting a search without valid consent or a legal exception, and applying cuffs without probable cause. That last point is what ended him. Because it wasn't just a bad stop. It was an attempted false arrest on camera. Grady was terminated. His termination letter cited policy violations related to traffic stops, search procedures, and arrest standards. He tried to appeal through the usual channels, but the body cam removed his ability to argue misunderstanding. The footage showed the sequence too clearly, and then came the certification issue. When an officer is fired for misconduct tied to unlawful actions, it doesn't just affect that department. It affects whether they can be hired anywhere else. Grady's file followed him. He could apply elsewhere, but departments that did their homework would see the same thing. He escalated a stop based on assumptions, then tried to arrest when he couldn't justify it. His law enforcement future collapsed fast. On the civil side, the case moved forward with pressure on the city. Malcolm's attorney filed in federal court under civil rights claims, including unlawful stop, unlawful search, unlawful detention, and false arrest. The filing was written like the video, clean and chronological. The city settled. They did it without admitting liability, because cities almost always try to avoid that language. But the settlement included real money, and it included non-monetary terms that mattered more long-term. The department agreed to changes tied directly to what happened to Malcolm. Supervisors required to respond sooner when a stop escalates to a search or cuffs without clear cause. Documented articulation required for traffic stops and searches, Bodycam compliance and regular audits, refresher training on consent searches and detention standards, and review of officers with repeated complaints involving stops that escalate without clear reasons. The department also had to preserve and produce footage faster under tighter rules, so footage couldn't disappear through delay or sloppy handling. Malcolm didn't celebrate publicly. He didn't do interviews to go viral. He didn't make it about status. He focused on the point that mattered. This happened because an officer decided his assumptions were enough to treat someone like a suspect. And Malcolm knew the only reason it didn't end worse is because he stayed calm, complied with lawful commands, and kept the record clear while the camera recorded the rest. Weeks later, Malcolm returned to normal life. Same kind of driving, same calm routine. But he also knew something important had shifted. The department had to put in writing what they were willing to tolerate. And Grady became an example inside that agency, not a hero, not a bad luck story, a warning. Because the system can ignore complaints when there's no proof. It can argue when there's no video. But when an officer's own camera shows an unlawful stop turning into a search, and then an arrest attempt with no cause, the excuses don't hold. So here's the takeaway for anyone watching. If you're ever in a situation like this, staying calm isn't weakness. It keeps you safe and keeps the story clear. Short statements matter. Consent matters. Asking for the reason matters. And cameras, body cams, dash cams, phones, business cameras, change outcomes because they stop people from rewriting what happened later. Now I want to ask you, if you were Malcolm, would you have stayed as calm as he did? Or would you have pushed back harder in the moment? And have you ever had a routine stop turn into something that felt personal? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share the story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, where people hold their ground and accountability catches up, make sure you like and subscribe.
All right, stand up right now.
I'm paraplegic. I can show you my ID and medical
Paper doesn't
paperwork.
matter. Stand up and prove it.
You're asking me to do something I physically can't do. I'm offering verification.
I think you're faking. Stand up.
You're creating a situation where
Either
I can't
take the
do
ID
anything,
or
right?
call a supervisor.
A police officer thought he could stand outside a medical wellness center, accuse a wheelchair user of lying about his disability, and force him to stand up in front of strangers. What he didn't know was that the man in that wheelchair wasn't just any client trying to get through his day. He was a medically retired federal agent who knew procedure, knew documentation, and knew exactly how officers try to twist a story when they lose control of a scene. And at this moment, we want to tell you that we're incredibly grateful that you've chosen to spend your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel alive and thriving. Now, real quick, tell us where you're watching from in the comments, state or country. And if you follow these stories for real accountability when someone abuses authority, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. This took place outside the Lakeside Adaptive Wellness Center at 2:15 p.m. on a Tuesday. The entrance and curb area were active. Clients were arriving and leaving. Staff were moving in and out. A security guard was positioned near the front. Security cameras covered the entrance and much of the parking area. The man in the wheelchair was Daniel Mercer, 50. He had been a federal agent until an on-duty injury in 2015 left him paraplegic. He was medically retired and used a wheelchair full-time. He came to Lakeside for therapy and adaptive training. He was known by staff and had a routine there. The officer was Travis Keene. He approached Daniel and did not treat it like a normal contact. He treated it like he had already decided Daniel was lying. He started with commands instead of questions and demanded that Daniel stand up and walk. Daniel told Keene he was paraplegic and could not stand. He offered proof right away. He attempted to provide identification and medical documentation. Keene refused to look at it and repeated the demand to stand. A staff member, Maya Rios, stepped in after hearing the officer's repeated orders. She tried to explain that Daniel was a client and that the facility could confirm his condition and appointment. Keene ignored her and continued focusing on forcing Daniel to comply with something he could not do. The security guard, Daryl Webb, moved closer and watched the interaction. He stayed in the camera view and monitored Keene's position and hands, because Daniel was seated and could not create distance if the officer escalated. A bystander, Leah Park, began recording on her phone after hearing the officer insist a wheelchair user stand. Other people nearby stopped and watched. The scene became public in real time. Daniel stayed calm. He kept his hands visible and moved slowly. He told Keene he was going to reach for his ID and did it carefully. He tried to keep the interaction focused on documentation and verification. Keene did not accept that. He spoke over Daniel and treated Daniel's explanations as excuses. He acted like Daniel was refusing on purpose instead of stating a medical fact. Then Keene said he believed Daniel was faking. Witnesses heard it. The phone recording captured it. The security cameras captured it. Daniel tried again to provide identification. Keene stepped closer while Daniel was still reaching. Staff and security locked in on Keene's hands because the situation was now on the edge of physical contact. Keene kept the contact going even though Daniel had already explained his condition and offered proof. Keene repeated that Daniel needed to stand and walk. He treated Daniel's medical statement like a challenge instead of information. Daniel stayed controlled and tried to end the confusion the fastest way possible. He told Keene again that he could provide identification and medical documentation. He also pointed out the obvious context. He was outside an adaptive wellness center where many clients used mobility aids. He made it clear he was there for an appointment and that staff could confirm it. Keene refused to take the easy exit. He told Daniel that paperwork did not matter and that the only thing he would accept was Daniel standing up. He also warned Daniel that refusing orders would create a bigger problem for him. Witnesses later described Keene's tone as confrontational and dismissive, like he was trying to force a public submission. Maya Rios, the staff lead, stepped closer and tried a second time to de-escalate. She told Keene that Daniel was a regular client, that the facility could verify his identity, and that they had records confirming his disability and treatment schedule. She offered to retrieve documentation immediately. Keene rejected her involvement and treated her like she was interfering. He told her to step back and stop talking. He made it clear he would not speak with staff about Daniel's medical status. That decision mattered because it removed the simplest verification option in the entire scene. Daryl Webb, the security guard, moved into a position where he could be seen by both Daniel and Keene. He did not touch anyone. He did not threaten anyone. He did what trained security usually does in a medical facility. He became a visible witness and focused on behavior and safety. He also indicated that the cameras were recording the entrance and curb area. Keene did not change his approach after being reminded about cameras. He did not slow down, and he did not call a supervisor. He stayed close to Daniel and continued repeating the same demand. Daniel attempted again to provide his ID. He told Keene he was reaching slowly, then moved his hands toward his identification. He kept his movements deliberate and visible. He was clearly trying to avoid any claim that he was doing something unsafe. Keene reacted as if Daniel's movement itself was suspicious. He told Daniel to stop moving and accused him of not following instructions. Several witnesses later said Keene was creating a situation where Daniel could not do anything correctly. If Daniel reached for ID, Keene treated it like a threat. If Daniel kept still, Keene treated it like refusal. Leah Park, the bystander, stayed recording the entire time. She adjusted her angle to keep both Keene and Daniel in frame, including Daniel's hands and Keene's position. She also captured the staff and security presence. More bystanders gathered, and the scene became loud, with people reacting and trying to tell Keene that Daniel could not stand. Keene's next move was to take control of the wheelchair space. He stepped in closer and positioned himself so Daniel could not roll away without bumping him. Daniel did not attempt to move the chair into Keene. He stayed stationary and focused on getting his identification out. Maya told Daryl to contact management and request a supervisor response. Daryl used his radio to notify facility leadership and to document the officer's behavior near a client with a declared disability. Someone in the crowd also called 911 and reported that an officer was demanding a wheelchair user stand and that the situation looked like it was about to turn physical. Daniel kept his voice steady. He repeated that he was paraplegic, that he could provide proof, and that he wanted the contact handled properly. He also told Keene that the facility had cameras and witnesses, and that he wanted everything documented. He did not insult Keene. He did not threaten him. He stayed focused on process and verification. Keene responded by treating Daniel's mention of cameras and documentation as disrespect. Witnesses described Keene's face and body language changing at that moment, like he felt challenged in public. He told Daniel to stop talking and comply. He then reached toward Daniel in the chair, while Daniel was still trying to provide ID. Keene placed a hand on the wheelchair and then moved his hand toward Daniel's arm. This was the point where multiple witnesses started shouting for him to stop. Maya stepped forward and told Keene not to touch Daniel and to wait for a supervisor. Daryl moved closer, still not touching anyone, but clearly preparing to intervene if Keene used force. Daniel tightened his posture and stopped reaching for his wallet because Keene's hands were now on him. Daniel kept his hands visible and tried to keep his balance in the chair. He told Keene again that he could not stand and that forcing him would cause injury. Keene did not step back. He kept hold of the chair and Daniel's arm. He looked around at the crowd, then back at Daniel, and continued acting like he was about to prove something in front of everyone. Keene tightened his grip instead of stepping back. He kept one hand on the wheelchair and used the other to control Daniel's arm. Daniel stopped reaching for his identification because he was trying to keep his balance and keep his hands visible. Maya Rios moved closer and told Keene to stop touching Daniel and wait for a supervisor. Daryl Webb, the security guard, moved into a position where he could clearly be seen by the cameras and bystanders. Leah Park kept recording from a few steps away, holding her phone steady. Keene ignored all of it. He acted like the crowd was the problem, not his hands on a wheelchair user. Daniel remained seated and repeated his condition and the risk of injury. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He focused on keeping the interaction procedural and safe. Keene did not treat it as a safety issue. He treated it as a contest. Witnesses later described him as determined to force a physical demonstration. He shifted his stance and pulled. It happened fast. Keene yanked Daniel forward and out of the wheelchair. Daniel did not have leg control to catch himself. He went down onto the pavement hard. People screamed. Maya rushed forward. Daryl stepped in and ordered distance while also calling for emergency help. Leah's phone captured Daniel on the ground and Keene standing over him. Daniel immediately showed clear signs of serious injury. His wrist position was wrong, and he could not brace himself normally. His face struck the ground, and he had visible facial injuries. He was conscious, but in shock and pain. He tried to stay controlled, but his breathing changed, and he kept his eyes focused, like he was trying to track what Keene would do next. Keene did not provide calm, clear aid. Witnesses said he looked around first, like he was checking who had seen it. Then he began trying to frame what happened as something other than force. He acted like Daniel had simply fallen during the interaction. That claim did not match what everyone had just seen. Multiple people immediately challenged it. The bystander recording continued without interruption. The facility cameras were still rolling from above, covering the chair, the officer's hands, and the fall path. Maya told staff to call 911 again and report that an officer had pulled a wheelchair user onto the pavement. Daryl instructed another employee to keep the area clear and to preserve the security footage. He also told someone at the front desk to notify facility management immediately. Daniel's wheelchair was tipped and out of position. A staff member and a bystander tried to stabilize it without moving Daniel. Daniel told them not to lift him abruptly. He stayed focused on preventing further injury and asked for medical help. Keene remained near Daniel and continued speaking as if he needed to control the narrative. He tried to make it sound like Daniel's body had caused the outcome, not his own actions. But the crowd, the phone video, and the camera coverage made that harder by the second. Within minutes, sirens were audible in the distance. More people gathered near the entrance. Several witnesses stayed in place specifically because they understood what would happen next. An official report would be written, and the report might not match what the cameras showed. EMS arrived and moved straight to Daniel. Staff from the wellness center guided them in and told them what happened. Daniel stayed conscious and gave short, clear answers. He told them he was paraplegic, that he had been pulled from his wheelchair, and that his wrist and face were injured. Keene stayed nearby and kept talking, but now he had a problem. The crowd had grown, and more than one person was recording. Maya Rios remained close enough to be heard and seen, and she made sure EMS and arriving responders understood that Daniel had not just fallen. Daryl Webb stayed focused on two things: keeping people back so EMS could work, and making sure the security footage was preserved. Leah Park did not stop recording. She captured the moments after the fall: Daniel on the ground, the wheelchair displaced, staff reacting, and Keene trying to control the scene. As EMS stabilized Daniel, Keene began framing the incident as an accident. Witnesses later said he used language that minimized his own role. He presented it as if Daniel's movement or the chair caused the fall. That version did not match what the crowd saw, and it did not match what the cameras captured. A second officer arrived and immediately looked confused by the scene. He saw a wheelchair user on the pavement, EMS working, staff upset, and multiple bystanders filming. The second officer attempted to get basic information and asked what happened. Keene answered in a way that put distance between himself and the force. Witnesses reported that he avoided saying he pulled Daniel out. Maya gave a direct account to the second officer and to facility management as they arrived. Keene had ordered Daniel to stand, refuse medical proof, then grabbed him and pulled him from the wheelchair. She also stated there were security cameras covering the exact area. Daryl told management which cameras had the clearest angles and confirmed that the system recorded audio near the entrance. He also documented the time and the positions. He treated it like an incident that would later be disputed because he had seen that pattern before. Daniel was transported to the hospital. The injuries were not minor. His wrist fracture required surgery, and he had facial fractures that needed specialist evaluation. Staff who knew him described him as tough and controlled, but this was the kind of injury that changes recovery timelines and daily function, especially for someone who relied heavily on upper body strength. Within hours, the first clip started moving online. Leah's video was short, clear, and hard to misinterpret. People shared it with captions calling out what they were seeing. An officer demanding a wheelchair user stand, then the man ending up on the ground. By that evening, the wellness center's security video became the missing piece everyone asked for. The facility did not release it immediately, but multiple employees confirmed it existed and covered the moment clearly. That alone increased pressure because it meant this was not going to depend on one person's word. The police department released an initial statement that tried to reduce the incident to a routine interaction and a fall during a compliance issue. It did not match what witnesses were already describing, and it did not match what the bystander footage suggested. That mismatch is what accelerated everything. The next day, Daniel's name spread, and so did his background. People learned he was a medically retired federal agent and that he had been paraplegic since 2015. That mattered because it made the faking idea look even more reckless. And it made Keene's insistence on forcing a stand look less like confusion and more like refusal to accept reality. Internal Affairs opened an investigation quickly because there was injury, video, and public attention. Civilian Oversight also initiated a review because the incident involved force against a person with a declared disability and multiple independent recordings. Keene was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department used careful wording at first, but the timing made it obvious they were reacting to the video, not just the injury. Meanwhile, Daniel's medical documentation, appointment records, and history at the facility created a clean timeline. He was there for legitimate care, he had a documented disability, and staff could confirm it. The question was no longer whether Daniel was who he said he was. The question was why Keene ignored every verification option and then used force anyway. Internal Affairs moved fast because this wasn't a private complaint. It was a public incident with injuries, multiple witnesses, and video from more than one angle. Investigators pulled everything that mattered in the first 48 hours. Dispatch logs, radio traffic, Keene's incident report, witness statements, EMS records, and the Wellness Center's security footage. Civilian Oversight opened a parallel review and requested the same materials, including any prior complaints tied to Keene. The security video became the center of the case because it showed the full sequence without gaps. Daniel seated in the wheelchair, Keene standing close, Keene refusing verification, Keene putting hands on Daniel in the chair, and Daniel ending up on the ground. Investigators compared that timeline to Keene's written account. Keene's report leaned hard on minimizing language. He described the outcome as a fall during a tense interaction. He framed Daniel as non-compliant and suggested Daniel's movement contributed to the fall. That might have worked in a case with no video. Here it made things worse because the footage showed Keene initiating the physical pull while Daniel was trying to provide identification. Internal Affairs interviewed the Wellness Center staff early. Maya Rios gave a detailed statement about Keene refusing medical proof and refusing staff verification. Daryl Webb gave a statement about the camera coverage, Keene's positioning, and the moment Keene made contact. Leah Park turned over her phone video and explained why she started recording, because Keene repeatedly demanded a wheelchair user stand and walk. Daniel's records from the facility also mattered. They showed he was a client with a documented disability, he had a scheduled appointment, and staff knew him. That removed any argument that Keene had no way to confirm Daniel's status. The facility verification was available in real time and was offered more than once. Civilian Oversight did what they always do in a high-visibility force case. They looked for pattern. They reviewed prior complaints involving Keene, including incidents where he escalated routine contacts, used aggressive commands early, or framed people as uncooperative after they asked basic questions. Even if some older complaints had been closed without discipline, the pattern became relevant once this video existed. The department tried to stabilize public reaction with cautious statements at first. That didn't hold. The online response kept growing because the facts were simple and easy to understand. People didn't need legal training to recognize the problem. A wheelchair user repeatedly said he could not stand, offered proof, and still got pulled onto pavement. Within weeks, the department released findings that Keene had violated use of force policy and failed to properly assess and respond to a declared disability. Internal Affairs cited unnecessary escalation, improper physical contact, and inaccurate reporting. Civilian oversight backed the conclusions and criticized the department for not intervening earlier based on Keene's prior history. Keene's career collapsed in stages, and each stage was tied to evidence, not opinion. First came administrative leave. Then came suspension and formal charges within the department. After that, the department moved towards termination. Keene's union representation tried to frame it as a misunderstanding and a chaotic scene, but the footage made that argument weak. The visuals showed the sequence clearly, and witness statements matched the video. Keene was fired, his name and record followed him, and he became unemployable in the same kind of work. Decertification proceedings were initiated, and his ability to remain in law enforcement became a separate issue handled by the state-level process. The district attorney's office reviewed the case for possible charges. The public wanted criminal accountability. The review happened and it was documented, but the case's final outcome on that specific point depended on legal thresholds and local decisions. What did not depend on discretion was the department's administrative decision and the civil case that followed. Daniel's recovery became a long process. The broken wrist required surgery and impacted his independence because he relied on upper body function for nearly everything. Facial fractures required specialist care and follow-up. Beyond the physical injuries, Daniel had to deal with something that hits hard for anyone with a disability. Being treated like your body is a lie that needs to be proven to strangers. Daniel did not do what Keene likely expected, which was disappear quietly. He retained counsel and filed a civil rights lawsuit. The case built like a timeline, not like a speech. It was medical records, facility records, video statements, and the contradictions between what happened and what was written down after. The settlement came after the evidence was fully developed and the exposure was obvious. The city agreed to an $8 million settlement for Daniel. Part of the agreement included policy changes and training requirements tied specifically to disability interactions, verification, and escalation control. The department implemented changes that were hard to ignore: mandatory disability awareness and de-escalation training with scenario testing, clearer rules requiring officers to accept verification options when a disability is declared, supervisor response requirements in high-risk public contacts involving medical vulnerability, faster preservation and review procedures for third-party security footage, stronger monitoring of officers with repeated complaints tied to escalation. Daniel didn't turn into a public speaker overnight, and he didn't need to. The case itself became a reference point in the community. People used it to push for better procedures at the wellness center, at the department, and at city meetings. Staff at Lakeside also changed their own protocols, including faster escalation to management when law enforcement contacts occurred on site, and clearer guidance on preserving footage immediately. The lasting impact was simple. A person with a disability did not have to perform ability to satisfy a suspicion, and an officer could not rewrite reality just because he wanted control. Here's the question for you watching. If you had been standing there, would you have started recording, stepped in, called management, called 911, or stayed back? And have you ever seen someone disbelieved about their disability in a way that put them at risk? If you want more stories where evidence, oversight, and accountability actually matter, drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Hey, let me see your ID. What are you doing right here?
What's the reason you need my ID?
Don't play games. ID, now.
What is the reason?
You're loitering. This is a drug area.
What?
Hands right.
A local patrol officer decided a black man standing on a downtown block at lunchtime had to be a drug dealer. He walked up, demanded identification without stating a clear legal reason, and treated the man's calm, minimal answers as suspicious. Within minutes, the officer escalated it into a detention in front of a crowd, with cameras recording from multiple angles. Before we get into how it started and why it mattered, thank you for spending your time with us today. Your support keeps this channel going. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you watch stories about accountability, body cameras, and people staying calm under pressure, like the video and subscribe. Now, rewind. It was midday on a busy downtown block. Office workers were out for lunch. Cars were double parked for deliveries. People were moving in and out of storefronts. In that same area, a federal team was running a street-level surveillance operation tied to a larger investigation. Special Agent Malcolm Reed was assigned to watch a specific section of the block and report movements. He was dressed to blend in. No visible badge, no police-style gear. He looked like a regular person standing outside during lunch. Reed was not there to talk to anyone. He was there to observe. His job depended on not drawing attention, and he could not give details about why he was in that spot. Officer Ryan Kessler was on patrol in the area. He was not part of the federal operation. He drove past the block, noticed Reed standing still near a storefront, and made an assumption based on appearance and presence alone. Kessler parked and walked directly toward Reed. He immediately demanded identification and asked what Reed was doing there. He did not describe a specific call, a specific complaint, or any clear facts connecting Reed to a crime. He treated it like Reed owed him an explanation. Reed kept his responses short. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain his assignment. He asked if he was being detained and what the reason was for the demand. Kessler took that as resistance. He repeated the demand for ID and began building vague reasons out loud. He suggested Reed matched the description. He claimed Reed was loitering. He implied drug activity without pointing to any actual behavior. People nearby started paying attention. Some slowed down. A few took out phones. One bystander, Tanya Morales, began recording steadily from several steps away. Kessler's body camera was running as well. That footage later became central. Kessler stepped closer and told Reed to place his hands where he could see them. Reed complied. Kessler then moved Reed toward the wall and began a frisk. Reed did not pull away or argue physically. He stayed controlled and still. Kessler was not satisfied. He treated Reed's calm behavior as suspicious and called for backup. A second officer arrived. Kessler spoke as if he already had justification, but he still did not name a specific crime supported by specific facts. He described Reed as evasive because Reed would not give detailed answers. Kessler then escalated the encounter to a detention. He told Reed he was being detained, moved Reed's hands behind his back, and put him in handcuffs on the sidewalk in front of passing pedestrians. Reed stayed calm. He did not resist. He did not reveal his identity. At that point, protecting the federal operation still mattered, and he did not want to expose the surveillance assignment on an open sidewalk. Kessler treated the cuffs like confirmation that his assumption was correct. He began moving Reed toward his patrol car to continue the detention and start the paperwork process that would justify it. But the detention itself had already created attention. Phones were up, the body camera was running, and the scene was now public. Once Reed was secured and it was clear the stop had already disrupted the mission, Reed made a decision. He would stop protecting the operation and identify himself. Reed waited until the cuffs were on and the detention was complete. He did not reveal anything while the officers still had the chance to turn the sidewalk into a scene that could compromise the federal team's target. But once Kessler started walking him towards the patrol car, it was clear the operation was already disrupted. People were watching. Phones were recording. The stop was now public. Reed stopped his feet and told Kessler, in a calm and even tone, that he was a federal agent. He gave his name and identified the agency. He also told Kessler exactly what mattered most in that moment. The officer had detained him without clear legal cause, interfered with an active federal mission and created a case that would follow him personally. Kessler reacted the way officers often do when they realize they misjudged the person they targeted. He didn't immediately apologize. He tried to regain control. He demanded proof. Reed didn't argue. He told Kessler where his credentials were and explained that pulling them out while cuffed wasn't possible without the officer's help. He also told him that there were other federal personnel nearby who could confirm, and that the easiest way to handle it was to call a supervisor and slow everything down. Kessler didn't slow down. He tried to press forward like it was still a normal street stop. He asked Reed more questions, trying to get Reed to explain himself. Reed stayed minimal and focused. He told him the explanation would be documented through the proper chain and that the current detention was already a rights issue. This is where the tone changed around them. The backup officer, who had been following Kessler's lead, hesitated. He didn't take over, but he didn't look comfortable either. He glanced between Kessler and Reed, and then at the phones pointed at them. He understood the risk of staying attached to someone else's bad decision. Kessler then did what a lot of officers do when they feel control slipping. He started justifying the stop out loud for the camera. He described Reed's behavior as suspicious. He referenced vague complaints and general drug activity in the area. He leaned on words that sound reasonable in a report, but mean nothing without facts. Reed didn't let him rewrite reality in real time. He told Kessler the justification didn't match what actually happened, and that the video would show the sequence clearly. The officer approached first, demanded ID first, escalated first, and detained without articulating a specific crime supported by observable facts. Then Reed delivered the part that landed hardest. He told Kessler this would not be handled as an oops. He told him the department would face a lawsuit. He told him the officer's own report would be compared line by line against the body camera and the bystander footage. And he told him that when that happened, the officer would not be protected. Kessler finally got on his radio and called for a supervisor, but even that was done like he was trying to manage optics, not fix the rights violation. He used a tone that implied he had a guy claiming to be federal, rather than admitting he might have detained the wrong person without cause. Within minutes, a sergeant arrived. Sergeant Holloway approached quickly, already trying to keep the situation quiet. He asked what was going on, and Kessler gave him the short version that made the stop sound cleaner than it was. Reed corrected it without raising his voice. He told the sergeant he was FBI, assigned to a surveillance mission on that block, and had been detained based on appearance and presence rather than any specific crime. He also told him the stop had now compromised federal work and triggered a legal and administrative problem the department could not control. Holloway asked for credentials. Reed told him exactly where they were. Holloway looked at Kessler and told him to remove the cuffs and retrieve them. Kessler hesitated. Holloway repeated the order. Kessler unlocked the cuffs. Reed immediately handed over his credentials. Holloway checked them carefully because now the sergeant understood this wasn't a normal stop and it wasn't going to be handled with casual explanations. Holloway stepped away and made calls. You could see it in his posture. The moment the credentials checked out, this stopped being a street interaction and became an incident. Kessler tried to talk over it, still defending the stop. He started listing reasons again. Reed didn't argue with every point. He focused on what would matter later, the lack of cause, the escalation, and the fact that the officer's story was already being recorded from multiple angles. Tanya Morales kept recording. She didn't get involved. She didn't approach. She just held the phone steady. Her video captured the cuffs, the tone, the moment Reed identified himself, and the shift in the officer's behavior after the credentials came out. Holloway returned and told Kessler to step back. He told Reed he was no longer detained and asked if he needed medical attention. Reed said no. He didn't act dramatic. He didn't posture. He simply stated he needed to contact his supervisor immediately. Because the operation had been disrupted, Holloway offered to move the conversation off the sidewalk. Reed declined. He knew why departments prefer private spaces after public mistakes. Reed wanted the timeline clear and the public scene documented, because the public scene was the truth. Reed called his supervisory special agent. He reported what happened in a structured way: time, location, officer name, the detention sequence, and the fact that civilian recording existed. He also reported the operational disruption and the safety risks created by drawing attention to the surveillance area. Within a short time, unmarked federal vehicles staged nearby, not for a show, but to stabilize what Kessler had destabilized. A federal supervisor arrived, spoke briefly with Reed, then approached Holloway with controlled urgency. The conversation between supervisors was short and serious. Holloway's tone changed again. This was now going up chains he couldn't influence. Kessler stood off to the side, watching his earlier confidence drain out. He had made a decision in public based on a biased assumption. He had escalated it in public, and now he had a federal agent, a sergeant, body camera footage, and civilian video, all pointing at the same problem. Before Reed left the scene to rejoin the federal team and assess the operational damage, he looked directly at Kessler and made the final point simple. The video and the paperwork were going to be compared, and that comparison would decide what happened next. By the end of that day, Kessler had already started protecting himself the way officers often do after a bad stop. He wrote his report like the camera didn't exist. He described the encounter as a proactive stop based on reasonable suspicion. He claimed Reed matched a vague description connected to drug activity. He wrote that Reed was evasive, uncooperative, and caused him to fear for safety. He also framed the cuffing as a necessary step to secure the scene while he investigated. The problem was that the body camera showed the sequence clearly, and the sequence is what makes or breaks these cases. The video showed Kessler initiating contact without a specific call or complaint. It showed him demanding identification before articulating any clear facts tied to a crime. It showed Reed staying controlled and minimal, not hostile, not threatening, not trying to flee. It showed the escalation coming from Kessler, not from Reed. Then the bystander video filled in what body cameras sometimes miss: the wider scene. It captured how quickly the public noticed. It captured the cuffing in full view of pedestrians. It captured the moment Reed identified himself and how the officer's posture changed after credentials were confirmed. Within 48 hours, the footage was no longer a rumor. It was in the hands of multiple people who had authority to act on it. Reed's supervisory chain reported the interference as a formal incident because it disrupted a federal mission and created a safety and integrity issue. At the same time, Reed's attorney preserved evidence and sent notices that made it clear the department was on the clock for records retention, including body cam, dispatch logs, CAD entries, and any related reports. That combination mattered. Federal involvement meant the department couldn't stall. Legal preservation meant the department couldn't lose things without it becoming another violation. Internal Affairs opened a case, not a casual review, a formal one with full video, report comparison, and data pulls. And once IA started digging, Kessler's stop wasn't an isolated problem anymore. It was a door into his entire pattern. They pulled his stop history. They pulled the demographic breakdown. They pulled his use of matched description language and how often it appeared in reports without an actual description attached. They pulled body camera compliance records. They pulled complaints that had been closed as not sustained because there wasn't enough evidence. Now there was evidence. A DOJ civil rights reviewer also requested information because the incident involved a federal agent detained without clear cause during a federal operation. That added another layer. It wasn't just policy. It was constitutional, and it was now being examined by people outside the department. The pattern showed up fast. Kessler had a high volume of stops compared to peers assigned to similar areas. His stops disproportionately involved black residents and black visitors to the downtown area. His reports repeatedly used the same justification phrases: suspicious behavior, evasive answers, failure to provide ID, officer safety concerns. The wording looked consistent, too consistent. Investigators started comparing his reports to body cam clips from prior stops, not just one or two, enough to show whether his language matched what actually happened. They found repeated gaps. The body cam would show normal, calm responses, but his report would describe people as agitated or hostile. The body cam would show him escalating quickly, but his report would imply the person forced escalation. The body cam would show him asking for ID before stating a reason, but his report would claim he developed suspicion first. In multiple cases, his reports treated a person's questions about legality as refusal to cooperate. That's a key difference. Asking questions is not a crime, but in his writing, it became a reason to detain. IA also looked at whether supervisors had been warned. They found that Kessler wasn't new to complaints. He had a trail. There were prior complaints about aggressive stops, unnecessary searches, and people being detained for vague reasons. Those complaints hadn't resulted in discipline. Supervisors had treated them as public misunderstanding, officer discretion, no video, or he's proactive. Now that explanation didn't hold. When the Reed footage hit internal review, supervisors couldn't claim it was unclear. They couldn't claim the citizen was lying. They couldn't claim the officer was being targeted unfairly. The camera showed the encounter from start to cuffs, and it showed how Kessler tried to justify it afterward. The department's legal unit became involved immediately because by the time the footage circulated, the risk was obvious. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a rights violation with a clean timeline and multiple recordings. It had a federal dimension, and it had a pattern sitting behind it. At that point, the department tried to do what departments often do to stop the bleeding. They attempted to frame it as a single mistake by one officer, but the data made that harder. The review didn't just show Kessler's choices. It showed how often his supervisors accepted his reports without scrutiny, even when stop outcomes were thin and the justifications were repetitive. It showed a lack of meaningful correction. Reed's case became the one they couldn't ignore because the person detained had institutional power, and the incident interfered with the federal mission. But the review made it clear that the same tactics had been used on people who didn't have a badge and couldn't force oversight. During the following weeks, Kessler was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation. His body camera footage from the incident was flagged as critical evidence. His report was formally challenged. He was interviewed by IA. He was asked to explain why the stop was initiated, what specific facts created suspicion, and why the detention escalated to cuffs. Those interviews are where officers usually rely on training and experience language. But in this case, training and experience couldn't explain the missing facts. And the more Kessler tried to defend his decision, the more he locked himself into a story the video contradicted. Meanwhile, Reed stayed disciplined. He didn't go on social media. He didn't do interviews. He handled it through official channels, but his attorney made sure the case didn't get buried and that the department understood the exposure. By week 3, the department was no longer asking if Kessler made a mistake. They were working through how much damage his pattern had already done and how much liability it created. Because when a department learns an officer exaggerates to justify detentions, every case that officer touched becomes questionable. By the time the reviews reached their final stage, the department's leadership understood 2 things. First, the detention of Malcolm Reed wasn't defensible on the facts shown on video. Second, Kessler's stop history made it impossible to treat this as a one-time judgment error. Internal Affairs completed its findings with a direct comparison. Kessler's written report next to the body camera and the bystander video. The contradictions weren't small. They were foundational. The report claimed a clear reason for suspicion that the footage didn't show. The report framed Reed as evasive and threatening in ways the footage didn't support. The report suggested a developing investigation when the video showed Kessler demanding ID first and building reasons afterward. That's the kind of mismatch that destroys an officer's credibility. Once credibility collapses, the job becomes hard to protect. Departments can defend mistakes. They can't defend patterns of exaggeration tied to rights violations captured clearly on camera. The DOJ reviewer's involvement made the stakes higher. This wasn't only about policy violations, it was about constitutional violations tied to biased enforcement. And now there was documentation showing the department had warning signs long before this incident. The department moved toward termination, and it didn't happen quietly inside a back office the way they prefer. The footage had already spread. People downtown recognized the location. The bystander video was shared widely. Community groups asked why the officer was still employed. Local reporters requested records. At the same time, the department's legal counsel began settlement talks because the liability picture was clear. The damages weren't only about the cuffing. The damages included the unlawful detention, the public humiliation, the operational interference, and the fact that the stop was driven by assumptions rather than articulable facts. The department also faced the wider issue. The review tied this incident to a larger pattern, which made the risk of trial worse. A trial would have opened the department's internal history, the stop data, the complaints, the supervisor notes, the decisions to ignore. Everything. That's why the settlement number climbed. In the end, the case closed with a $4 million settlement. It was large enough to make the department's budget people angry, and public enough to make leadership stop pretending this was minor. Then came the personnel decision. Kessler was terminated. The department's termination letter cited policy violations tied to improper stops, escalation without sufficient legal cause, and report accuracy issues. The final decision relied heavily on the fact that his written account did not match the footage, and that the same issues appeared across multiple prior stops when those videos were reviewed. And Kessler wasn't the only one affected. The review didn't stop at the person holding the cuffs. It also examined who signed off on his behavior for years. Supervisors who repeatedly dismissed complaints and accepted thin justifications faced discipline. Some were removed from supervisory roles. At minimum, the department had to acknowledge internally and publicly that the pattern existed and that it was ignored until it hit someone the system couldn't casually minimize. The department also made operational changes, not because it suddenly wanted to, but because the settlement and the federal review forced it. They tightened requirements for articulating reasonable suspicion in reports. They changed documentation rules, so matched description could not be used without a documented description reference. They increased audits of stop data by race and location. They strengthened body camera compliance and made it harder to end recordings early without consequences. They also created an early warning threshold that triggered review when an officer's stop volume and complaint history crossed certain limits. Those changes didn't fix everything overnight, but they changed the department's ability to pretend it wasn't happening. For Reed, the outcome was clear but not celebratory. He didn't treat it like a victory lap. He treated it like accountability that should have happened earlier before other people were pulled into the same situation without the ability to force review. He also treated it like a reminder of how quickly professionalism gets read the wrong way when someone has already decided what they think they're seeing. He had stayed calm. He had stayed controlled. He had given minimal answers to protect a mission. And none of that stopped an officer from escalating, because the officer wasn't reacting to behavior. He was reacting to assumption. The key lesson in this case wasn't complicated. The video showed what happened. The report tried to describe something else. And when those two were placed side by side, the truth won. That's what ended Kessler's career. Not a speech, not a rumor, not a viral headline. A clean timeline and a clear record. So here's the question for you. If you were standing on that sidewalk watching it happen, what would you have done? Would you have recorded? Would you have kept walking? Have you ever seen a situation where the official story didn't match what people witnessed? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you've been through something similar, share what happened. And if you want more real-world story times about accountability, recorded proof, and consequences that actually stick, make sure you like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story.
Stand up. Need your ID.
What is wrong?
Just give me your identification.
What's the legal reason you need it?
You're too suspicious. I'm not going back and forth. Stand up, now.
I'm requesting a supervisor. Right now.
A local officer thought he could walk into a quiet downtown cafe, single out a black man minding his own business, and demand identification like it was a personal right. What he didn't know was that the calm man at the window table wasn't just another customer he could pressure into complying. He was the head of internal affairs, and every step the officer took was about to become evidence. And before we jump in, we just want to say, we're genuinely grateful you chose to spend your time with us today. Your support is what keeps this channel going. Now tell us where you're watching from in the comments, your country, your city, your state. And if you like stories where arrogance meets cameras, policy, and real consequences, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with careers, charges, and a sentence nobody expected. So here's what happened. It was a weekday morning downtown. The cafe was the kind of place packed with laptops and quiet conversations 2 blocks from the courthouse, with security cameras in plain sight. People were in work clothes, students were studying, and the staff were moving fast behind the counter. Malcolm Pierce sat alone near the front window. He was black, late 40s, dressed like any other professional on a day off. Coffee on the table, laptop open, phone set to the side. Nothing loud, nothing confrontational. Just a man using a public space the way everyone else was. Malcolm also happened to be the head of internal affairs for the city's police department, but nobody in that cafe knew that, and Malcolm made sure it stayed that way. Officer Tyler Grady walked in without ordering anything. He didn't scan the pastry case or check the line. He scanned people. He moved with the attitude of someone used to turning normal situations into contacts that looked productive on paper. He locked onto Malcolm and went straight to the table. Grady demanded identification immediately without giving a clear reason. He positioned himself close enough that Malcolm couldn't stand up and leave without bumping into him. That body positioning mattered because it quietly turned a casual demand into a controlled space. Malcolm didn't argue and he didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach into his pockets. He kept his hands visible on the table and asked one clean question that forces accountability, whether he was being detained or free to leave. Grady avoided answering. Instead, he repeated the ID demand and treated Malcolm's question like disrespect. Then Grady tried to justify it after the fact. He claimed Malcolm looked suspicious. He implied Malcolm matched a description. He suggested the cafe had concerns. The problem was the room itself didn't match the story. The staff looked confused, not relieved. The customers looked uncomfortable, not protected. And the cafe manager, Asha Moreno, stepped out from behind the counter and watched closely because she could tell this wasn't a response to a call. It was an officer creating a reason in real time. Malcolm stayed in the same calm posture. He asked what specific facts supported the demand. He asked what legal cause existed. Grady escalated by shifting to control language. He treated Malcolm's refusal to hand over ID as non-compliance, even though there was no clear lawful basis stated for the demand. He warned Malcolm that refusing would lead to consequences. That was the first major procedural mistake, trying to convert a voluntary request into a forced demand without articulable cause. Grady then moved the encounter toward detention without doing the one thing that makes detention lawful, stating specific, checkable facts tied to a crime. He kept it vague on purpose because vague sounds safe in the moment. Vague also collapses later when video exists, and video did exist. Grady's body camera was on. The cafe's security cameras covered the seating area from multiple angles. Asha knew exactly where those cameras pointed and how long footage stayed stored. She quietly noted the time and which cameras had a clean view of the table. A barista named Eli Tran also noticed the pattern. He saw an officer crowding a seated customer, heard the tone, and watched the officer refuse to explain the stop. Eli didn't want to get involved directly, but he did what a lot of people do now when they feel something is off. He pulled out his phone and started recording audio discreetly while keeping his distance. Grady tried another pressure tactic. He told Malcolm to stand up. Malcolm didn't stand. He stayed controlled and asked for a supervisor. Grady brushed past that and acted like his own authority was enough. Then Asha stepped closer and made it clear, in a manager's tone, that Malcolm was a paying customer and that staff had not requested police intervention. She didn't challenge the officer emotionally. She challenged the basis of the officer being there. Grady responded by dismissing her input and continuing the stop anyway. That was the moment the encounter shifted from questionable to openly reckless, because Grady was now overriding the very business concern he had implied earlier. The excuse stopped matching the reality in the room, and the cameras captured that mismatch clearly. Malcolm still didn't reveal who he was. He could have ended it instantly by identifying himself. But Malcolm understood something most people never get to use. The best accountability case is the one where the officer can't claim he was treated differently because of rank. So Malcolm let the officer keep choosing his own steps. Grady then called for backup and described the situation in a way that made Malcolm sound like a problem. He used language that would prime the next officer to arrive ready to handle someone, not to evaluate legality. That was another procedural violation starting to form, creating a misleading narrative over the radio to justify actions already taken. Within minutes, a second unit arrived. The responding officer walked in, looked at the scene, an officer standing over a calm, seated man, a manager nearby, a room full of witnesses, cameras on the ceiling, and hesitated just long enough to show he wasn't fully buying what he'd been told. Grady didn't like that hesitation. He immediately pushed for physical control, instructing the responding officer to help him force the situation forward. Malcolm didn't go back to the cafe. He didn't call the precinct from the street. He handled it the way he expected any resident to handle it, because he wanted the process to be clean. That afternoon, he wrote a timeline while it was still fresh. He listed the time window, the exact location, what Grady did first, what Grady claimed as justification, how the justification changed, when Grady called for backup, when the physical contact started, and when the supervisor ended it. He kept it factual and short. Then he filed a formal complaint through the public intake channel. He also sent a preservation request. He requested the full body camera files for Grady and the assisting officer, the dispatch audio, CAD logs, GPS pings, supervisor communications, and any in-car video tied to the units that arrived. He specified the full time window, not just the few minutes outside. That mattered because a lot of cases got shaped by missing context. Malcolm wasn't giving anyone room to trim the story. At the cafe, Asha did what she said she would do. She pulled the footage from every camera with a view of Malcolm's table, the aisle, the entrance, and the sidewalk. She saved a longer segment than most people would, starting before Grady entered and ending after the supervisor left. She also wrote her own statement while it was fresh and got contact info from 2 customers who said they'd confirm what they saw. Eli saved his audio recording and gave it to Asha so it could be stored with the cafe footage instead of sitting on a personal phone. 2 days later, Grady submitted his report. It was the kind of report that tried to make the stop sound routine and lawful. It leaned on vague suspicion. It referenced a description without details. It described Malcolm as non-compliant. It emphasized resisting to justify going hands-on. It also included the trespass angle, even though the manager had rejected that in real time. The complaint would normally have been routed for a standard review first. Malcolm made sure that didn't happen. Not by taking control of the case, but by doing the opposite. He disclosed internally that he was the complainant, and he formally recused himself in writing. He assigned the investigation to his deputy, Raymond Holt, with clear instructions. Run it like any other citizen complaint, document everything, and do not treat it as a special case in either direction. Holt opened the file and immediately treated it like a case that could turn into a lawsuit or a federal issue. First, he issued evidence holds. He locked down the Bodycam file's dispatch data and any related digital logs, so nothing could be overwritten. Second, he collected the cafe footage directly from Asha and documented chain of custody. He didn't accept a text message clip. He took the original exports from the system with timestamps. Third, he pulled the body camera files and compared them against the cafe angles. That comparison created the first clear problem. The cafe footage showed the approach, the lack of a clear stated reason, the manager contradicting any business complaint, and Malcolm staying controlled. It also showed the moment Grady went hands-on, and it showed how quickly Grady labeled it resisting. Grady's body camera captured the sound and general sequence, but the angle got worse during the most important outside portion. Holt noted it, then requested the file metadata and the audit logs. He wanted to know if the file had been edited, re-uploaded, trimmed, or processed in any way outside normal procedure. At the same time, Holt reviewed Grady's recent activity because the language in the report looked familiar. It used the same phrases that showed up in other complaints: suspicious behavior, matched description, refusing lawful orders, consent, resisting. Holt pulled Grady's stop history for the last year and filtered it by location and unit. The number of contacts was high compared to other officers working the same downtown area. The number of stops that resulted in actual charges was low. The number of searches marked as consent was unusually high. That didn't prove anything by itself, but it told Holt where to look next. He pulled a sample of past incidents tied to Grady and the same small cluster of officers in that downtown unit. He matched them to any available video, any citizen recordings, and any prior complaints that had been closed. Then he started seeing the same pattern over and over. Stops justified with vague descriptions. Reports that sounded polished, but didn't include specific facts. Bodycam issues that seemed to happen during the critical moments. People being labeled as resisting when the video didn't show aggression. One case had a report claiming a man agreed to a search, but the audio didn't show a clear agreement. Another case had a report claiming a woman made a threatening movement, but the video showed her hands up. Another case had a camera malfunction that began right before an alleged discovery. Holt documented each discrepancy. He didn't jump to conclusions. He built a list. Then he received the audit logs related to Grady's Bodycam file from the cafe incident. The logs showed access and handling that didn't match standard workflow. The file had been opened and processed more than once before it was officially turned over for review. Holt flagged it immediately. That was the first moment the case shifted from a bad stop to a potential evidence issue. Holt briefed command staff with a summary that stayed clean and professional. Clear contradictions between report and video, concerns about body cam handling, and indicators that this might not be an isolated event. Command staff tried to contain it at first. They discussed quick discipline, retraining, and moving Grady out of downtown. Holt shut that down by pointing to the evidence handling concerns. If evidence was being manipulated, internal fixes weren't enough. Holt scheduled formal interviews. Asha, Eli, the two customers, the assisting officer, the supervisor, and Grady. Grady's interview followed the same line as his report. He insisted the stop was lawful. He repeated the vague justification. He emphasized resisting. When Holt pressed for specifics, Grady couldn't provide clear details that matched the footage. Holt also asked about the camera angle shift outside. Grady said it was incidental. Holt didn't argue. He logged the answer, then logged the audit data that suggested the file had been handled in a way that required explanation. By the end of the second week, Holt had enough to take the next step without guessing. He prepared a referral package focused on two things: pattern indicators tied to the downtown unit and possible evidence handling violations connected to Grady's camera files. That package didn't accuse. It presented facts, comparisons, and timestamps. Holt didn't send a vague summary up the chain. He sent a tight packet. It had the cafe security timestamps, the Bodycam timestamps, the dispatch log, and the exact places where Grady's report didn't match what the cameras showed. It also included the Bodycam handling logs that showed the file was accessed and processed more than it should have been before it was turned over for review. Once that packet landed, the department couldn't treat this like a normal complaint. Command staff pulled in legal counsel and ordered a review of the downtown proactive unit, not just Grady. They requested stop data, search rates, complaint history, and body cam availability for the entire unit over a defined period. They tried the usual first move: quiet containment. Grady was pulled off the street and placed on administrative duty pending investigation. The department also ordered him not to discuss the case and not to access any related files. Holt kept building the case on proof, not opinions. He interviewed Asha and secured the original security exports with chain of custody documentation. He took Eli's audio file and logged it the same way. He interviewed the assisting officer and documented that Grady's radio framing didn't match what the assisting officer saw upon arrival. He interviewed Sergeant Klein and documented that Klein ended the stop because the justification wasn't holding and the situation was becoming a public problem. Then Holt went wider. He pulled a sample of prior stops from Grady and the same unit. He compared reports to any available video and dispatch logs. The pattern showed up fast: vague justifications repeated across stops, high consent search claims, low actual charges, and video gaps or malfunctions during key moments. He also found repeated report language that looked copied and reused, like officers were writing from a script instead of documenting real specific facts. In several cases, the scripted language didn't match video. That's when the risk changed. This wasn't just a bad stop. It looked like a unit practice. Holt escalated again, this time with a second referral, focused on constitutional violations and evidence handling issues. He didn't label it as criminal in the memo. He laid out facts and logs that made outside review unavoidable. When outside investigators requested records, the tone inside the department shifted immediately. Supervisors got cautious. Officers stopped talking freely. Command staff started holding meetings with lawyers present. Grady reacted badly. He complained that he was being targeted, tried to figure out who filed the cafe complaint, and kept assuming it was some guy trying to make trouble. He still didn't know it was Malcolm, and Malcolm still stayed fully recused. So nobody could claim this was personal. By the end of the month, multiple members of the downtown unit were under review. Some were reassigned, some were suspended. Supervisors were being questioned about how reports were approved without verifying video. The first real break didn't come from a confession. It came from records. Federal investigators lined up 3 things across stops tied to Grady's downtown unit: dispatch data, body cam availability, and the wording in reports. They were looking for repeat contradictions, not one-off mistakes. They found them fast. They found reports claiming calls for service when dispatch showed no call. They found matched description language with no description that could be verified. They found repeated consent search claims where audio didn't show clear consent and where people were asking if they had a choice and not getting a straight answer. Then they focused on files. The cafe incident was the cleanest example because there were 2 independent recordings: the officer's body cam and the cafe's security system. When investigators compared them, the timeline held, but the most important moment had a problem. The body cam angle got worse right when Grady went hands-on. The cafe footage stayed clear the entire time. Investigators pulled evidence handling policy and compared it to what the logs showed for the Bodycam file. The file had a handling trail that didn't match normal workflow. It showed access and processing outside the standard review path before the footage was officially requested through the complaint. That pushed the case from policy violations into evidence issues. They went back to older stops tied to the same unit and found similar patterns. Not every stop had missing footage, but enough did, and the gaps clustered around the exact moments that mattered: searches, handcuffs, and resisting claims. The reports also used the same wording over and over, like they were written from a shared script. Federal agents interviewed civilians who had filed older complaints and never heard back. Some still had phone videos, some had screenshots, some had paperwork from detentions that never led to charges. The stories were consistent: vague reasons, pressure tactics, and then reports that made it sound lawful afterward. Then they interviewed officers. A junior officer gave a practical statement. The unit had a habit of keeping report language consistent, and certain officers would help clean up reports so supervisors wouldn't question them. Investigators didn't build the case on that statement alone. They used it to target proof. They subpoenaed internal communications, draft histories were available, access logs, and supervisor approval patterns. They looked for who touched reports before submission and who approved without checking video. That's where they found the messages that mattered: discussion about keeping reports tight, making sure wording matched, and concern about the cafe incident becoming a thing. It wasn't a movie-style confession. It was enough to show intent to manage the record. Then Grady did the worst possible thing while under review. He was on administrative duty and under orders not to access related files. He attempted access anyway. The system logged it with his credentials and a timestamp. It wasn't someone's opinion, it was a record. That became the clean evidence tampering lane, violating access restrictions during an active investigation tied to footage already backed up by a private business system. Once that was in place, the department moved to protect itself. Grady was terminated. The downtown unit as it existed was shut down and restructured. Supervisors who approved the reports without verification were removed from that chain pending review. The city publicly confirmed cooperation with federal investigators because it was past the point where they could pretend it was contained. Now, the federal case took center stage. The U.S. Attorney's Office filed charges focused on civil rights violations and evidence tampering. The civil rights side targeted unlawful detentions and stops built on race-based suspicion and vague justifications. The evidence side targeted the attempts to interfere with Bodycam handling and the pattern of report falsification tied to video gaps. When the case went public, Malcolm's name finally entered the story, not because he announced himself in the cafe, but because paperwork and sworn filings made it unavoidable. The irony was obvious. The person Grady tried to bully into handing over ID was the person responsible for investigating officers who violated policy and law. The defense tried the standard approach. They argued Grady acted in good faith. They claimed the footage didn't show everything. They tried to frame the Bodycam angle shift as accidental. They pointed to officer discretion and said the stops were based on training and experience. The prosecution kept it simple. They played the cafe footage next to the Bodycam footage and let the jury watch the story change in real time. They showed the manager contradicting the business concern angle. They showed the lack of a stated crime. They showed the escalation when Malcolm asked basic legal questions. They showed how resisting was claimed without matching behavior. Then they showed the logs, file access that didn't follow policy, access attempts during investigation, and messages that showed people were thinking about controlling the narrative. They also brought in the pattern evidence. Multiple stops with the same vague language, the same consent claims, the same report style, and the same convenient video problems. That's what made it bigger than one incident. The jury wasn't asked to decide whether Grady had a bad day. They were shown a method. Grady was convicted. At sentencing, the judge didn't treat it like a paperwork issue. The judge treated it like what it was: abuse of authority backed by falsified documentation, aimed at people who were targeted because they were easy to target until the day the wrong person sat at the wrong table with cameras everywhere. Grady received 15 years in federal prison. Not probation, not a short sentence. 15 years. After the sentencing, the fallout continued. The city settled several civil lawsuits tied to the unit's stops. The department implemented stricter stop documentation rules and mandatory body cam audits with random reviews. Supervisors were required to verify video before approving reports in certain categories of stops. The downtown unit's mandate changed, and the oversight structure changed with it. Internally, the case became a training example, not the sanitized kind, the kind that shows exactly how a stop becomes unlawful step by step, and how I can do what I want turns into I can't explain what I did. Malcolm never needed to embarrass anyone in public to prove a point. He handled it through process, evidence, and a clean chain of documentation. He let the system record its own failure, then forced it to face the record. And if you're watching this thinking about how often people are told to just comply and deal with it later, here's the reality. Later only works when there's proof. And proof only exists when someone preserves it and the process isn't allowed to bury it. What would you have done in that cafe? Would you have argued? Would you have recorded? Would you have walked out and hoped it ended? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've seen something like this in your own city, share what happened. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and stick with us for more stories where accountability actually lands.